August 2005, you guys might remember Hurricane Katrina. Over 1,800 people died in New Orleans. The question that was raised by a lot of folks in the media and around the country was who was responsible for those deaths. Was it just nature? Was it the federal government? Was it the state of Louisiana? Or was it the city of New Orleans? As you can imagine, the mayor of New Orleans had his point of view there. As you can see, he is speaking to President Bush and asking the federal government, FEMA specifically, to come down and help with the problem. Meanwhile, President Bush was visiting with the director of FEMA and uttered the famous last words, "Heck of a job, Brownie," and that was mocked by most people in the media, showing that President Bush was really out of tune as to how poor of a job FEMA was doing in the eyes of many.
Oh, Brownie. Hey, do you remember when it finally got on the ground and it wasn't even New Orleans? That's right, it was Mobile, Alabama. And I said, Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job. It's so funny because you were not doing a heck of a job. That's right, you're doing the opposite of a heck of a job. Oh, Brownie.
Even Kanye had something to say. So the debate may continue regarding whose fault it was, who was supposed to be in charge there in Louisiana. But the answer will definitely be found, if it is to be found at all, in the issue of federalism. Now, the United States is a pretty unique system with regards to the way we divide power between the different levels of government. The national government, Washington, D.C., the state governments, even the local governments. This idea of federalism was really created by the United States. Most countries either follow the system of unitary government, like France, where it's pretty much just the national government controls everything, and there may be localities run by mayors and local officials, but they are under the supervision of the national government entirely. Confederacy would be an instance where there's lots of different organizations, different states, if you will, but they have complete sovereignty and are not subject to the national government at all. Whereas in our system of government, known as federalism, the state and local governments, along with the federal or the national government, each have their area of authority, and in many cases, even the national government cannot tell the states what to do, nor can the states tell the national government what to do. So it's these different areas or spheres of sovereignty that are unique to the United States. And the Constitution lists many of the powers that the federal government has. Those are known as the enumerated or the delegated powers, also known as the expressed powers. That would include the declaration of war. Only Congress, the national government, can declare war. There are also powers that are inherent or implied, which we'll talk about soon, and that's kind of things that are not expressly in the Constitution, but the courts have decided, yeah, they kind of have this authority in Congress. Then we have reserved powers. Based on the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, these are powers which, because it doesn't state in the Constitution that it's the federal government's responsibility, then it automatically goes to the states. And that would be something like education, where most of the funding and control of education happens at the state level, not at the federal level. And the last one we would look at would be called concurrent powers. These are powers that the federal government has and the state government has. Example of this would be taxes. So you pay your federal taxes and you pay your state taxes, dang it. And you know what happens if you don't. Or if you don't know, you should go ask Wesley Snipes. Yikes. I know what you're thinking. Mr. Fry, what if the state and the national government disagree over who has control over a particular area of legislation or policy? Well, according to the Constitution, Article 6, the supremacy goes to the national government. So the case you could look at is marijuana. States like California say that, oh yeah, it's legal for you to grow and or own and or smoke some marijuana if you have a medicinal card. And the federal government says, wait a minute, That's actually our area of responsibility, and we say that's not okay. And that's why you can get busted from the FBI even if you have a medicinal marijuana card. And that's why the FBI has been shutting down dispensaries all over California the last year or so. Another factor here is because the Supreme Court has the power of judicial review, the court can kind of change or reinterpret what the Constitution means. We can look here at the case of employee pay, minimum wage specifically. Initially, the court said that this was a state responsibility to set minimum wage. They then reversed that decision and said now since 1985 that the federal government can set a minimum wage. Now you might notice at work the poster on the wall that shows a federal and a state minimum wage. So the state can still set a minimum wage, but it cannot be lower than the federal minimum wage because the federal government has supremacy in that area. The courts have also decided cases stating whether or not governments can be sued and in which cases. So one example you'll see here is the American with Disabilities Act, which is a national law, and people had tried to sue state governments under this federal law, and the court said you cannot do that. You can sue in a state court, or you can sue the federal government in a federal court. You can't sue the state in a federal court. And the exceptions, of course, have to do with the 14th Amendment, which applies the Bill of Rights to individuals at the state level. Obviously, the federal government has interest in whether or not the state is violating your rights. Go ask your parents or the average Joe whether the state or national government has more power. They'll probably tell you the national government. It wasn't always the case. Certainly not in the beginning of our nation. So let's talk about some of the things that eventually gave more power to the national government. Some powers the national government has have to be implied, as in the Constitution, by the Supreme Court. On one occasion, the most famous, McCulloch versus Maryland, that was a case where Congress had created a national bank. One of those branches of that bank was in Maryland. The state of Maryland resented the fact that there was competition between their own banks. And so they thought, national government, if you're going to put a bank in our state, we're going to tax that bank. And it was questionable as to whether the national government, could pay a tax to a state bank or whether they had to. So this went to the Supreme Court of the United States. Chief Justice John Marshall delivered the decision in this case, and he said a couple of important things. First, that the national bank was constitutional. It was an implied power that the national government had the power to establish a bank, and this was based on the necessary and proper or elastic clause of the Constitution in Article 6. Second, he said that the states do not have the power to tax the national government. The second way in which the national government received more power was through the interpretation of the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. Wow, don't get me started. We'll start way back with Givens versus Ogden. In this case, the navigation of the ports of New York were regulated by the state, and monopoly was pretty much given to a specific group that was in charge of the navigation there. The charge was that because the goods were coming in through that port but were being distributed interstate through many different areas, that the country, the national government, should really be in charge of controlling that commerce and certainly of taxing it. So the court there just said that in this case it is interstate commerce, therefore it is the national government's responsibility, and that was the beginning, I should say, of a big growth in the commerce power. Continuing into the 20th century, during FDR's New Deal, there was an attempt by the government to actually set the prices of wheat, and there was a particular individual that had his farm and he grew his wheat, and he didn't send his wheat to other states. So he said, this is not an issue of interstate commerce. I'm only selling it locally. I do not have to comply with your price controls. The Supreme Court there actually said, well, because you producing wheat and selling it actually has an effect on market prices for wheat generally, and I know this is getting in a little bit too much complicated economic talk, but the court said in that case, because the production of your wheat at a certain price actually affects the price, the average price of wheat across the country through different states, that Congress can actually regulate your production and sale of wheat on the local market. So this was a pretty broad opening for the expansion of the Commerce Clause, saying that the national government now has more power than they did before. And this lasted quite a while until 1995. There was actually a guy that showed up to a school in Texas with a gun. The federal government said, that's our jurisdiction, we get to prosecute him because of a congressional act called the Gun-Free School Zones Act. The court said, no, not in this case. Gun safety, or schools in general, these are things that are controlled by the state of Texas, and therefore they get to prosecute Mr. Lopez, not the federal government. In the summer of 2012, the Supreme Court ruled on a Commerce Clause issue regarding Obamacare, the health care plan of the Obama administration. So I'd like you to look this over. We're going to discuss it at length in class. It regards the mandate, the individual mandate, whether or not the government could force people to purchase health insurance. Civil War also gave more power to the national government. I think that one's pretty obvious. While even today there is a lot of disagreement over whether the government, national government, has too much power, I think we can all agree that in the era of civil rights, it was important that the national government usurp some power in forcing the hand of states to implement policies that would, for instance, integrate schools. And as we can see here, the National Guard was called in to force a governor to do so with regards to his schools. So we've covered rather extensively the difference between states and federal government and the supremacy between the two when there are laws that conflict. But what about different states? There is a part of the Constitution called the Full Faith and Credit Clause, which states that one state must honor the other state's laws. And the most simple example of this is you get a California driver's license, you then go on vacation to New York. They cannot ask you to get a New York driver's license while you are there if you're just on vacation or for a short stay, and so they have to honor your California driver's license. The courts still, though, have to speak with regards to same-sex marriage. There's no national law about same-sex marriage, and in fact, states like Hawaii might have already legalized same-sex marriage. So if you get married in Hawaii, does that mean that you move to California and now you're married here? Well, that's something that they need to decide. If you watch TV or movies, you probably have heard of extradition. This basically means that if I commit a crime, say in California, and then I flee to Nevada, if the police in Nevada catch me, they have to send me back to California so that I can be on trial there for the crimes I initially committed. And this was first made known in the case of Puerto Rico versus Brownsted in 1987. Please proceed to part 2.